Hello, everyone, and welcome to the April webinar of MLE International. I'm Carol Benson, founder and co-director of MLE International with Irina.
Hello, everyone. My name is Irene Iwasaki, and I'm also a co-director of the MLE International Network, and it's a pleasure to have you here.
So,
So,
oh yeah,
oh,
go
no, go ahead.
ahead, Irina. Okay, we both wanted to tell you that MLE International is a network of scholars and practitioners. We're involved in research and technical assistance in supporting L1 based multilingual education in multilingual countries. And our goal is to become a nonprofit. We're still working on that, but hopefully next time we'll be able to report that we've finally gotten our status. We really, our ideal job is to continue supporting implementers around the world with different technical tasks as they kind of need them. So we're very happy today to introduce Dr. Feliciano Chimbutane and Dr. Carlos Manuel, both from the University of Eduardo Mondlane in Maputo, Mozambique. We thank them for using one of the languages in their repertoires of multilingualism. So we're using English for this webinar, but if you have questions and you want to ask them in another language, we can handle Portuguese and French today at least. So welcome, Feliciano and Carlos. I think we can just go right into, if you want to say something more about what you've been doing, present yourselves a little bit more, and then go right into your presentation. We've asked for the presentation to be approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll have 45 minutes if we need it for discussion. So we welcome all your comments. Please, you can put your comments and questions in the chat, and we'll try to monitor it along the way. So welcome, Feliciano and Carlos, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carol, and also thank you very much, Irina, for inviting us. We're happy to be here sharing what we know about bilingual education policy and practice in Mozambique, and also to learn from all of you about multilingual education around the world. We will address 7 points, but don't worry about the number of points. Some of them are very brief. I'll take you from point 1 to 5, and my colleague, Carlos Manuel, will take you from there. We have three main objectives in this presentation. First, we will share some findings from studies on bilingual education and practice in Mozambique. We've been part of some of the studies, but other studies are from other authors. So we summarize what we consider relevant to present today. We will examine both the affordances and also the challenges of policy implementation in the country and reflect on what we consider to be the current state of affairs and the way forward. We find it important to share some sociolinguistic and also educational context of Mozambique for you to better appreciate what we're going to say about bilingual education policy and practice. Mozambique, according to the 2017 census, is a home of about 27 million people. In this country, depending on what you consider to be language or language variety, we have about 24 African languages, all of them of the Bantu family, spoken in the country. As I mentioned, some authors consider that we have 30, others they say that we have 50 languages, depending on what counts as language or language variety. About 80% of the population have an African language as their mother tongue. As you see, the majority of the population conducted their life mainly in African languages. Portuguese is spoken by about 58% of the population, of which about 16.5% speak it as a mother tongue. But here again, this is what the people declare in census. In here, you have people with different proficiencies in this language. Despite this linguistic landscape, Portuguese has been defined as the sole official language in this country. This is the situation from the colonial rule. It was maintained after independence in 1975. Monolingual education in Portuguese is what we consider to be the mainstream system in the country from primary to tertiary education. However, since 2003, bilingual education is being offered in rural contexts in some primary schools. Up to 2023, only 29% of primary school students were in the bilingual program. So this is why we consider monolingual program in Portuguese as the mainstream program in this country. In addition to Portuguese, 19 African languages are being used as the language of instruction. So depending on the region, they choose one African language and Portuguese as the language of education. The bilingual education program has been in place since 2003, but only in 2018 it was considered to be official in the country. Until then, it was considered to be an experimental program after 5 years before of a pilot program. Since 2020, it has been in slow expansion, and my colleague Carlos Manuel will tell you the story since 2025. The bilingual program has been at a standstill, which is our concern at the moment. When bilingual education was adopted in 2003 up to 2019, an early exit transition model was adopted, in which there was an abrupt transition in grade 4. So from grade 4 onwards, Portuguese was the language of instruction. However, after some criticism, some studies, and also the observation that the model was inefficient, so a new model was approved in 2020, and it has been in force since then, which we call mid-exit transition, gradual transition model, in which the transition starts in grade 3 per subject, meaning that some subjects are taught in African languages, whereas others are taught in Portuguese. And the full transition starts in grade 6. So it's only in grade 6 that all subjects are taught in Portuguese. So why the government of Mozambique decided to introduce bilingual education, and what are some factors that are pushing back the implementation of this program? In terms of drivers, I think one of the obvious one is that about 7% of the children don't speak Portuguese when they start schooling, yet they have Portuguese as their language of instruction. So because of this language issue, or at least in part because of that, there are high failure rates in primary education, or only a few kids complete primary education in Mozambique. And also from the late 1980s and the early 1990s, the academy and also the civil society started to demand that the government address social inequalities in education, which includes the use of the right of the children to use their mother tongue as their language of instruction. There are also claims that the use of African language in education is a way of affirming sociocultural rights and identities, and also a way of preserving these languages and cultures. However, there are some factors which are still pushing the bilingual education back. One of them has to do with what is called in the literature as coloniality of language. In the case of Mozambique, that means that Portuguese has been constructed as the language of progress and social distinction, whereas African languages have been constructed as symbols of tradition, and also inferior forms of speech. That has been the case since the colonial rule. So after independence, this situation didn't change much. And after independence in 1975, Portuguese was declared language of national unity, which means that other languages were considered even divisive in the Mozambican context. So the construction of the state, the progress of Mozambique was supposed to be done surrounding around the Portuguese language. Also, we have to acknowledge that the Portuguese is the de facto language of socioeconomic mobility, which pushes parents, many parents, in particular mid-class parents, to educate their kids in Portuguese and not in African languages. These parents and also some segments of the society also consider that African languages in education can be a barrier to access to Portuguese and the capital, social capital associated to this language. So because of all these factors, priority in Mozambique is being given to monolingual education in Portuguese and not to bilingual education. And this has consequences, as I will show next. So we've been witnessing gains, but there are also challenges in the implementation of the program in Mozambique. In terms of outcomes, we can consider learning outcomes, but also sociocultural outcomes. Learning outcomes include the fact that studies and also people on the ground, including parents, teachers, consider that students in the bilingual education, they actively participate and understand L1 content than when it is in Portuguese. However, they are still concerned with the development of Portuguese proficiency. So the program is still failing here to help kids develop Portuguese proficiency. There is also some evidence, some coming from lights, that there is some transfer of the coding skills from L1 to L2, but again, there are low levels of reading overall in Portuguese and also in African languages. So these are some of the strengths, but also the weaknesses of bilingual education currently. In terms of socio-cultural gains, the use of African languages in education have been contributing to promote and develop African languages and associate cultures. In fact, when bilingual education was introduced in late 90s and also in 2000, we only had religious material written in African languages. But since then, we have materials written in different domains. We have dictionaries, grammars in African languages, many people studying this language and also documenting this language as a result of their use in education. Also, parents and the community can participate better in education of the kids, including helping them at home with their homework because they understand the language and also the content that is being transmitted through those languages. So those are some of the gains that we report from bilingual education. However, there are some challenges, and we'll see the consequence of this challenge in the coming slides. One of them is the weak training of bilingual education teachers. This has to do with the lack of investment, and also moderate political will from the government. Also, lack or shortage of teaching and learning materials, in particular in African languages, from grade 4 onwards. There are also some problems in communication among different stakeholders, including the Ministry of Education, parents, and also implementation partners. For instance, in terms of implementation partners, some of them come to Mozambique and say that they are helping implementing bilingual education, but in fact, they focus on development of literacy in L1 and also in Portuguese, and they don't support uh, other subjects like maths or from grade 4 onwards. So they concentrate their support on grade 1 to from grade 1 to grade 3, not onwards. Because the government is not investing much in terms of teacher training, also production of teaching and learning materials, bilingual education, in fact, depends on donor support in Mozambique. Based on what I said, we can see that there is some mismatch between what we call the policy of bilingual education and its implementation. I will show here three cases or three examples of that mismatch between policy and practice. One has to do with the fact that, which has to do with lack of teaching and learning materials actually. The 2003 and 2019 models of bilingual education, for instance, they say that bilingual education runs from grade 1 to grade 6. Now it's the end of grade of primary education, grade 6. It was grade 7 until recently. However, because there are no books in grade 1 from grade 4 to grade 6, the teachers and schools resort to teaching in Portuguese and using materials in those languages. So in practice, bilingual education ends in grade 3. So the improvements that we mentioned in terms of the model, 2019 model with late transition or mid-exit transition, in fact, doesn't materialize. So consider to be this resulting from inadequate policy prioritization and the lack of investment. So as a consequence, there is a lack of implementation fidelity. So what the policy says is not what is happening on the ground. As a consequence, teachers, parents become demotivated, and also that exacerbate resistance to bilingual education. And you can see from this account, from this school director saying, we have been implementing bilingual education, but since we have material difficulty, we have to adapt. And adapting here means not teaching those subjects in L1 as expected, but in Portuguese, and also using materials that are meant to be used in the monolingual program. The first one was about teaching and learning material. This one has to do with the lack or poor teacher training. So, as I mentioned, from grade 4, natural science and social science are supposed to be taught in African languages, but the teachers don't feel prepared to teach those languages in this language, those subjects in this language. Although they are native speakers of African language, they don't have the language, the skills to teach those subjects in their L1. So again, poor prioritization and investment means lack of implementation fidelity, demotivation, and resistance, as I mentioned, in relation to the previous case. And here you can see also this account, and were facing problem because they didn't receive training for teaching natural science and social in grade 4. So since they are not prepared to teach in L1, so they teach in the language they are strong in. The last case has to do with the expansion of the program. In 2019, a bilingual education expansion strategy was approved, and the program was supposed to be extended throughout the country. But as I mentioned, until 2023, only 29% of the kids in primary school were in the bilingual program. And most of those, actually more than 50%, were in 2 provinces. Why? Because at the time, those provinces had the support of US aid. With the shutdown, as you can imagine, what is happening in those provinces without the support of US aid. So again, moderate political will and the resistance, including within the Minister of Education, means that the investment to bilingual education is poor, so implementation is dependent on partners and donors. And you can see this account from this representative of an NGO mentioning clearly that there is some resistance within the Ministry of Education. So they do what they can in order not to let the bilingual education advance. So I will hand over to Carlos Manuel to take you from here to the end of our presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Feliciano, and thank you, Carol and Irina, for inviting us for this webinar and discuss issues about Mozambique. I'll take from Feliciano to talk about the current situation concerning bilingual education in Mozambique. Some of you may know that I'm following Feliciano's part, will now know the bilingual education started being implemented in the 1990s, first as a pilot, then as an experimental program, and now as a full-fledged bilingual education program. And by now you would probably think that it is robust, given the experience that we have. But if you think that is the case, that's not the case, because the state of bilingual education is far less robust and dynamic than what we would anticipate by this time. 2 major factors, in fact, the same factors, but from 2 different sources. One is external and the other is internal. When we're talking about here some of the sociopolitical aspects that we have heard. When we talk about external factors, Feliciano has mentioned them. Please, let's, the next slide, please. Yeah, Feliciano mentioned the 2024 US elections as a factor, because with that, the new administration withdrew US aid support. In Mozambique, US support was pivotal for bilingual education. It helped teacher training, linguistic language mapping, TLM, teacher and learning materials production and supply. In fact, by the time US aid left, they were in the process of producing 19 materials for 19 Mozambican languages plus Portuguese from grades 1 to 3. A math book, bilingual education book for grade 4, and all that stopped. In terms of internal factors, we also coincidentally in 2024 we had our own elections, and with it in 2025 we had a new government, though belonging to the same political party. It brought a new team to the Ministry of Education. Next. And the new team at the Ministry of Education brought something which everybody suspected that this may be leading to demise of bilingual education. In fact, in December, on the 31st, 2025, they issued a ministerial directive where they said that all schools that did not have textbooks for bilingual education should enroll their students in the monolingual program. And they urged all education authorities in the provinces and districts to comply with this directive. Civil society and scholars raised concerns about this directive, particularly because of the broader implications that it would bring. To start, this directive followed some recent, at the time, then recent political speeches and elite positions suggesting that bilingual education was not important. What was important then was education in Portuguese, the language of national unit. And so when this ministerial instruction came in, people thought rightfully that it would have a domino effect. We also witnessed that earlier practices had been put in place to favor monolingual education. For example, we had times when teaching and learning materials had not been present in schools, but no instructions such as this one had ever been issued. In fact, right now, I'm in Niassa province, where I've been to the provincial directorate, and now I'm in the district of Lago, and talking to teachers, school directors, and even official from the education directorate. And there are, right now, at least in this province, there are no books, monolingual books, for grade 2 and grade 4. But those students are not being asked to move to a different education modality, as was the case for the bilingual education. So there is fear that monolingual education is being favored over bilingual education. Logistical issues, in fact, we know, and it was mentioned right today at the meeting that I was, that there are bilingual education books in the warehouses, in the provincial warehouses and in the district warehouses. Right here in Lago, where I am, they have bilingual education. And so they don't know why they are not distributing it. The domino effect that we talked about was also mentioned at the meeting we had yesterday, whereby some schools had, when they saw the ministerial instruction, they just stopped teaching bilingual education. So there had to be a provincial committee to go through all the districts and schools to say, no, we are not saying you have to stop. If you have materials, then you don't. But if you do, then teach. The fact is, some schools just said they didn't have any. Next. So the contestation by the scholars and the coalition of civil society organizations to the ministerial directive had some major arguments. The first one was that they thought that textbook distribution concerning bilingual education had never been fully integrated into the national system on purpose. The fact was, and more recent studies, in fact, had even suggested that bilingual education textbook had been integrated within the national system, the national logistical system of the education system. However, people did not understand why now they were saying that there are no books. The second argument was that there were persistent nationwide challenges in textbook distribution, not only in bilingual education, but also in monolingual education, as the case that I've just mentioned, but no conversion of students from the monolingual education had ever occurred into the bilingual education, which, for example, should have happened in Zambezia, in Nampula, when USAID was funding their bilingual education. There were cases where the monolingual did not have materials, but the bilingual had, but no such case had ever happened. They also noted that students who had been originally slated for bilingual education in 2026, if they were redirected to monolingual education, they would face exactly the same problems that the ministry said wanted to avoid. Why? Because they would not have textbook. And why would they not have textbooks? Because the ministry, by October, has all the statistics of students that it's going to cover in the next year with textbooks. And this instruction was issued in December, which means that it was issued past the time that statistics for books had already made, and so they would not have books. Next. In light of those concerns, the scholars and the coalition of the civil society made three major recommendations. The first was instead of stopping bilingual education in those schools, they should employ teaching programs, manuals, workbooks, and other support materials, just as had been done with monolingual education. The argument was teachers are prepared to use teaching programs, to use their teaching manuals, and plan their lessons and teach. And this has been an experience that Mozambican teachers have had for long. When monolingual education did not have textbooks, the ministry prepared workbooks. So this coalition asked that the ministry prepare workbooks instead of stopping bilingual education. The second one was to conduct a thorough inventory of bilingual textbooks in provincial and district warehouses with partner support. And the fact that partner support was asked to be there was fears that the ministry might know, because they knew that there are books, but might say that they don't have books while the books were there, just as the case that I'm talking about now in Niassa. At the time, people were talking about textbooks in Zambezia and Nampula, in the warehouses in the districts in the province. And the last recommendation was to keep bilingual education in school, and while the ministry worked on a clear, feasible plan to resolve all the identified constraints. And in this fact, also civil society and scholar involvement was asked to be present. And I attended a meeting, one meeting where the ministry was asked to have this working group, and the minister was asked, in fact, to set a working group involving people from the ministry, people, scholars, and also people from civil society. And the minister said, yes, they would do it. And she recommended that the director of primary education do it. But up to now, I don't know if that has ever been implemented. Next. So in light of the contestation and the recommendations, the ministry's response was that schools should not operate without textbooks. So if bilingual education did not have textbooks, then the students should be going to where textbooks are, which was monolingual education. But as we can see right now, sometimes monolingual textbooks are not present in schools. They also claimed that they did not have funding specifically for bilingual education materials. The question made then was, how then did this happen? Why was bilingual education not a priority? They also said that they needed to reorganize the sector, including alignment of bilingual education curricula with the monolingual curricula. You might ask, why should be it the case after having implemented bilingual education since the 90s? Why was it now necessary to align its curricula with the monolingual one? The next thing was that they said that there was need to define a national language policy, clarifying which languages merited inclusion in education and under what conditions and statuses. The question might be, isn't the Constitution enough? Because the Constitution predicts that this language be used in education. And the other question might be, why, if this policy is not in place, why then Portuguese is there after all? But because of the complaints and concerns issued by civil society, the minister came out one day and another press conference, and it was the minister herself who assured society that there was no intention of abolishing bilingual education. However, there's been no relevant action or plan to show otherwise. In fact, next. In fact, when that press conference was held, a scholar in a WhatsApp group wrote the following statement. They said what they are saying, what the ministry is saying, is just politics. They've already killed off bilingual education. Schools have already abandoned the program. Provincial offices and district services lack resources. It's just to silence the program supporters. So we only have to fight back. So still here from this quote, you can see that the fears and the concerns are still there, particularly because even this after the reassurances that bilingual education will not be abandoned, nothing specific, no specific plan, no clear-cut plan has been put forward by the ministry. When we look at this, we find that there is potential demands of bilingual education. And if that happens, there are implications. The major implications are educational, sociocultural, and cultural continuity. In terms of educational implications, the main concern is with equity, in the sense that rural children who are already disadvantaged by Portuguese-only instruction would face widening inequalities and reduced learning opportunities. In terms of sociocultural impacts, the loss of intergenerational communication, erosion of community linguistic practices, and weakening of ethno-linguistic identity should be expected. Because in fact, if you go and ask parents, one of the main reasons why they want bilingual education is to keep the language of their communities, to keep intergenerational communication and identities in place. Then we also risk cultural continuity, the fact that we will curtail local language promotion, cultural maintenance, and the broader socio-cultural gains that we have had with bilingual education. Next. Having reached this point, we have our summary and conclusions. One, which is the most important here, and which is what studies have always made sure they say this, and we have evidence of this, is that there is potential of bilingual education in Mozambique, even though it needs to be maximized. So it has the potential to improve learning opportunities of students who speak African languages, but flaws in its implementation have prevented this potential from being realized. We mentioned here flaws in teacher training, flaws in production and distribution of teaching materials, but also of misinformation in terms of attitudes by those who are against bilingual education. We find policy and practice mismatch between the educational policies and their effective implementation, the teacher training needed for smoother implementation, the material production for smooth implementation, all of that lags behind. Expansion, which should now be, I don't know at which point, remains slow and overly donor dependent. They've been, in terms of adaptations and resistance, we find that implementation constraints have forced improvisation in bilingual education, fueling discredit and resistance to program among stakeholders. For example, by the time we have transition into Portuguese only, a lot of code switching. There is because of lack of materials, teachers have to improvise. So we have lots of adaptation, but we also have resistance to bilingual education. And finally, we suggest the following way forward. We think to have, first of all, bilingual education where it should be by this time and improve its expansion, we need strengthened political commitment together with improved communication and academic and civil society institutions and grassroots actors. It's essential to enhance the implementation and outcomes of bilingual education in such a way that everybody is on board, but also in such a way that everybody knows the objectives of bilingual education, and in fact, in such a way that everybody knows which are the implications of bilingual education in the goals of bilingual education. Having reached this point, I want to thank everybody for listening to us. And because Mozambique is a bilingual country, the speakers are all bilingual, multilingual country, and the speakers are also multilingual countries. We say thank you, which is English, if you didn't know. No shukuru, which is emakua, and obrigado, which is Portuguese. Kanimambo, Shangana.
Kanimambo.
Thank you.
Kanimambo to both of you. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and very well timed also. Um, Feliciano, if you want to stop sharing, then we can bring you to the front. That's great. Thank you. Um, we really appreciate this presentation. There's already a couple of questions, and I already have a million questions for you, but thank you so much for talking about your data from different studies and also bringing it up to present to kind of show us what's happening right now. I wonder if we can just give a little space for TJ D'Agostino from Notre Dame University. He's joined us. And I thought he could just give a little bit of context of the light study, which you mentioned, but we didn't go into detail about that. So, TJ, do you want to just say a few words from the car? You're
I'm
muted, though.
I'm gonna I'm gonna pull over. I wasn't sure how soon we would get to this point. I'm just close to the office, but thanks. I came a little late. Apologies for joining late, but it was a pleasure to see our former colleagues Carlos and Feliciano, and to hear about what's going on. Though I have to say a little concerning. So we had the pleasure of working together between I think about around 2022 and 2025 on a large study of bilingual education policy in Mozambique and in 5 other countries called LIGHTS, which stands for the Language of Instruction, Transition, and Education Systems. And we covered a lot of interesting ground in that study, but included some consideration of the political dynamics. And at the time when we finished, the data collection was occurring a few years ago. And at the time, the story was really one of emergent prioritization of bilingual education and expansion. And I think we saw some of these concerning implementation signs or potential risks or threats that you've just described, but at the time it still seemed like there was momentum in a positive direction, though perhaps risks of some of that momentum eroding. So just to say, I share Carol's thoughts about it being really interesting to get an update, also a little disheartening. If I can maybe mention one or two other things. So there is a report out in both Portuguese and in English that you can find pretty easily if you Google Mozambique lights. That is housed in Notre Dame's. We had to self-publish the final report of the USAID study because USAID disappeared right before we published the reports. But these are out and available, and there's a lot of interesting data and information in those reports. But also, we hope to have some forthcoming papers on this as well. We may need to update the one, I'm thinking, Carlos and Feliciano, on the politics of the situation in Mozambique before we publish that one that's currently under review. But the last, I guess, thing I'll say is just, there's a cross-national study too that we are just submitting that includes Mozambique data as well as part of the story. Maybe the last thing I'll just ask is a question, if I may, while I have the floor, which is, what do you think changed most fundamentally in the past couple of years that led to this shift? Because it seemed like, at least while we didn't say in our analysis that the prioritization in Mozambique was totally secured, we definitely described it as emerging, and it seemed like the direction or the momentum was going in a positive direction. And now, while it doesn't seem like we've lost prioritization completely, it seems maybe like the momentum is going in the other direction. And I wonder if you have either ideas or theories about, you know, other than maybe the feasibility concerns getting louder, is there anything else that changed in the context that led to this situation? Thank you so much.
Thanks. Please go ahead, Feliciano and Carlos.
Luciano, wanna go first? Or?
Yeah, I can go first. You can then come. Yeah, what changes? I think the last slide is from Carlos can help us explain what has changed. I think the new government, but mainly the new staff in the Ministry of Education may be the main responsible for the change that we're witnessing today.
Yeah.
So we don't think it's something institutional, but the power of some people who we know that for a long time were not supporters of bilingual education, even when we were piloting the program at Indy. So those people are now at the Ministry of Education, and they're using their powers to weaken bilingual education. So we think that is the big change, because even in the manifesto of the party in power, they mentioned that they will support bilingual education. So it's hard to understand the shift that we are witnessing nowadays. So we think that it's a matter of individuals, not institutional as such. Carlos, I don't know whether you want to add to that.
Yes, that, and I agree with that. Even though I'm gonna say it differently, it's a matter of power, just like Feliciano is saying, but it's also a matter of what I would say or think to be weak institutions, in the sense that we have we have people who, when they come into power, they become more powerful than institution. Because if the ministry had been powerful as an institution, maybe something would, which is exactly what Feliciano is saying. But now the question is, are the institutions weak or are they weakened? I don't know. But yeah, that's what I would say.
Really helpful answers. Thank you so much. And I think that's so if I'm understanding you guys correctly, you're talking about the power of individuals at certain
Yes.
positions. And then
Yes.
if the ministry as a structure, as a ministry had been stronger with more responsibilities outlined, maybe that wouldn't be affecting it as much. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, that's the idea. Because
Yeah,
there are documents, there are
Yeah.
right.
legal
There's a
and
strategic plan.
yeah, there's a strategic plan showing that by this time bilingual education will be expanded, but it's not happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to give the floor to, I think it was Kate Shell who asked a question early on. Kate, can you ask your question yourself in your own words?
Sure. Yeah, actually,
Thanks.
as I was a lot of questions were coming up as you were presenting. It was a fantastic presentation, very fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing. If it's okay, Carol, I'm actually going to ask my second question that I posted because
Good,
I'm more interested in that one. And then if
good.
there's time, we can go back to the other. But I was really interested to hear about this coalition that has been so active in advocating for bilingual education and, responding to the government and really holding the government accountable to the policy. And I would just love to hear more about how that coalition came together who's involved in that, what the collaboration looks like, just to understand more about those actors.
Let's
Yes.
take the
Carlos?
questions as they come because they're going to be different, a little bit different from each other. So please go ahead, Carlos and Feliciano.
Yeah.
The coalition that we are talking about is called MAPT, which stands for Movimento de Educação para Todos, Movement of Education for Everybody, for all. And they advocate education for all, as it says, and they involve institutional membership and individual membership as long as the institutions and the people are interested in issues of education. So whenever, I don't know if Carol knows, she should know, Progress is one of the members of MAPT. Progress is a local NGO working in education, bilingual education as well. So whenever issues of education come up, they are the first. And in fact, they are the coalition, the institution, the civil society institution with which the ministry works, usually advocates education. All this year, they had this issue of bilingual education, for example, but they also had the issue of night shift classes with the ministry, which was a whole other instruction from the ministry. So, yeah, so it's a coalition of local NGOs working in matters of education in the country. Feliciano?
Yeah, I think that's all.
It's clear. And can I just tag on to that question because I was also interested in, you quoted somebody from a WhatsApp group who's obviously an activist or one a concerned person. If we think of the Kosonen and Benson framework, probably a lot of people from the side, like you guys who are academics and NGO people. I'm wondering if that WhatsApp group is an official group and if it's related to this organization, Movimento de Educação para Todos.
No.
That was just
this WhatsApp group was just set up when the issue of bilingual education came up. Yeah.
But it continues.
Yes, it's still on. It's still on. Yeah, still on.
Because I think that's a really good signal that there's a group of people who are worried about this and talking about it and keeping the issue active. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
I know.
I was to say that in the past, as Carol knows, the power was coming from the universities. There were academics and a few NGOs who were fighting to have bilingual education in place. But now the soldiers coming from different orientations, from different civil society organizations. So it's no longer only the academy, but the people from other areas as well. So the community has grown nowadays.
That's great. And you use soldiers in the way of talking about what Irina talks about in Senegal as the militant, the people who are activists, right? On behalf of MLE or in what is called bilingual education in Mozambique. Thank you so much for that. Chris Darby, do you want to talk? You're worried about policy issues, and do you want to?
He had to leave, I
Oh, he
think.
had to leave.
Yeah,
Okay.
so
He was also interested in what evaluations have taken place, especially longitudinal studies. And maybe I'm guessing that he's thinking about the language mapping and some of the stuff that was done with donor support that you mentioned earlier. Were those helpful things that the that were done, even though it was for early grade reading, I'm guessing. But did some of those studies help support bilingual education?
As I mentioned in my side of the presentation, yes, there are many studies that are showing that the kids are actually learning when African languages are used as language of education. But I think all studies are showing that there are no much progress in Portuguese, the acquisition of Portuguese and the learning in Portuguese. So this is one of the weaknesses of bilingual education. And why is so? It's because we have those problems in terms of implementation. It's not, if teachers are not trained properly, if we don't have materials in L1 beyond grade 3, we cannot expect much from the program. So that's why we consider that the program has to deliver, but in order to deliver, it has to be better implemented. For that to happen, it's not enough to depend on donors. The government must, because education in this country is the responsibility of the government. The government must embrace bilingual education and they invest properly in order for it to have successful results.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I see a question from Jenny Bister. Jenny, do you want to ask your question? And welcome.
Thank you. It's been a long time.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I was actually in Mozambique from the 90s up until 2017, and I was in Tet province. So all of these discussions are really near and dear to my heart. So I'm very happy to hear that things have continued to evolve and change. And we do hope that there's progress. I was just wondering if you were able to identify any inputs or initiatives from civil society that might have impacted or encouraged the acceptance or success of bilingual programs. I'm thinking specifically of things like churches that often use African languages in their services. Would those places have more interest in children being educated in mother tongue? That's like one example I can think of. Is there anything like that?
And maybe I could just tag on to that because I was also wondering about the grassroots support for bilingual education. What about like the general public and are people asking for bilingual education? So maybe those two things will give you something to talk about.
Yeah, when I was presenting the context of Mozambique, sociolinguistic context, and also the education context, I've shown that there is something that comes from the colonial rule, which we call coloniality of language. If you know about the Portuguese rule, which was close to the French rule, different from the British rule. The British rule was for what we call the separate development. So with that policy, they allowed local community to develop their language and develop their cultures. But the French and the Portuguese, they fought for integration, for assimilation. So the population of Mozambique, in particular mid-class and the upper class, are part of that assimilate communities who are more linked to the Portuguese language and the Portuguese culture and associate capital. So are those people who are in power who make it, in most of the case, difficult for the implementation of bilingual education. Because when we go to the rural areas, parents are for bilingual education. if not much for education gains, much for social cultural gains. So they defend bilingual education, but they also understand that for their kids have social mobility, they need Portuguese. So rural communities usually want both Portuguese and African language. The same doesn't happen in urban areas, in particular with the mid class and upper class societies, which for them, African languages have no value. For them, it's Portuguese, and nowadays, it's also English. There are many parents in the urban areas that are educating their kids not in Portuguese, but in English. So, acceptance of bilingual education uh, can have this divide between the rural and the urban area, between the grassroots communities and also just middle class communities. And to answer your question about civil society organizations, we think that the NGOs, more than churches, are the ones who have been pushing for bilingual education. The church, yes, have been using the languages in their churches, okay, but and the parents, one of the things that they say, my kid now can read the Bible, so I'm happy because of that. But in terms of pushing for bilingual education, we have some NGOs in this country who have been championing for bilingual education. Progress is one of them, and some others that are appearing nowadays. Carlos?
Yes, I would say yes, that's the fact. And when we look at bilingual education, the parents were well mobilized because that's another issue in terms of implementation, mobilizing the communities, telling the communities the real goals of bilingual education. They are on board with it. We have, just like Feliciano was saying, they know the capital that Portuguese brings, but they also know the cultural, the social cultural aspect of the local languages. So they are, in fact, on for with. We had in some study, we had parents saying, we are now living a new era. Nobody calls us dogs. Nobody calls our languages of dogs. And this is thanks to bilingual education. However, one thing they noted was we don't want to have bilingual education as a second-class education. So the real one did. Some of the gains that communities mentioned, even though churches are not on board in the sense of advocating for bilingual education, one of the gains that communities mentioned is that the children read the Bible in local languages. They help the community. They worship in local languages, reading the Bible, reading these theological textbooks. So yes, to add to what Feliciano said, this is what will happen. He mentioned Progresso. We should mention Udeba, which did a very interesting job in Gaza. Yeah.
That's a Mozambican NGO as well, right?
NGO, yeah.
That and they work nationally or mainly in certain provinces?
They worked in certain province in Gaza, but their work was, if you like, they were contaminated the whole country.
In a good way, right?
In a good way. Yeah, in a good way.
Contamination in English is fairly negative, but
yeah, in a good way.
Great. Thank you. Irina had another question related to implementation.
Yes, thank you so much, Feliciana and Carlos. I read and I was, I helped with the lights report, so it was really nice to hear it again, but also I think I share the sentiment that Carol and TJ were expressing in the sense that it does feel a little disheartening what's happening, but I'm also wondering now, this is based on just the trajectory that we've noticed in Senegal. Senegal also had two failed government-led attempts at scaling bilingual education. And then of course there were no and sometimes it was due to funding, sometimes it was due to implementation challenges. But what happened in 2008 at that time is that there were many NGOs and programs that started implementing on their own. And so there was like a sort of a saturation of, yes, relatively smaller scale programs, but everyone was kind of doing it and at their scale. And then one NGO in particular kind of stood out um, in reaching over 100 classrooms, um, and really becoming the big advocate for bilingual education. And they experimented or implemented a late exit model. So they even, they got funding to do grade one, grade two, uh, early, what do you call it, preschool, and then the first grade till fourth grade at the beginning. And then they applied for Trust Africa funding to do grade 5 and 6. So they really did complete the whole primary cycle. And they were the ones who then advocated for this bilingual education model. The results were positive. They disseminated the overwhelming positive results of L2 acquisition by doing bilingual education properly, right? Implementing it well. And because of that, that kind of spearheaded conversation at the ministry level. Then they were supposed to be the leading organization to scale this together with the ministry. And then early grade came in with USAID, but then they brought in, and then there was little things about design that had to be ironed out because early grade has a different design than what bilingual education was doing, and they covered all the subjects, right? They were covering all the subjects. That organization was covering the subject. So I kind of wanted to know if in this precise moment when things are a little bit in the down, is there NGOs like you mentioned, Progreso, the other one where communities like us, or we can draw attention from potential funders to build capacities of these NGOs to do proper implementation, bring attention towards that so they could continue the work, even though the government itself is kind of a little quite negative towards bilingual education, and create sort of a model of positive and proper implementation for future convincing and advocacy and scaling. Yeah.
Yeah,
Your
Irina,
first, oh,
I was to say, yeah, Irina, the thing is that at the moment, as you know, this is a global problem. No one is funding anyone. So progress is there, Udeba is there, but there are no funds. There are no funds coming to help those NGOs implementing their programs. And we mentioned about the blockage at the Ministry of Education. There is still a window um, from the Gates Foundation that is willing to support Mozambique, although it's not the kind of support that we used to have with USAID, the small scale in terms of technical assistance, actually, not implementation per se. But you see, they are trying to have a memorandum of understanding for about 8 months. They are not getting it from the government. So what we're saying is that there are no funds, and the small cases of funding that we are having, we are not taking them properly as we should. And so the Minister of Education is not helping much. But we also have the problem of having those experiments, the small scale experiments going very well funded, very well, but when they're scaled up, they don't have the same results. So that is something that needs to be discussed in this system of funding, in this system of doing small scale experiments and then trying to scale it up. Because the government are not taking them up. If they don't do that, so nothing is happening.
Thank you. Yes.
I might add, and in fact be more specific, there is this resistance we're talking about within the Ministry of Education, the blockage that Feliciano was talking about. And also because our system is very centralized, all schools must, I don't know if you remember the word that came in the ministerial instruction, which says comply. That is very key in our context. You have to comply, you have to work within the system, and the system that is in place right now is what Feliciano was talking about. But when Irena was talking about those NGOs that worked kind on the side, it reminded me of the case of Mozambique when one of the drivers of bilingual education was the communities. Feliciano, you remember it, that the communities were the ones who asked for bilingual education after seeing what was being done, what was happening with the schools that had bilingual official, let's so to say, official bilingual education schools. So we've had not from NGOs, but from the communities. However, the implementation is what failed. Some may say because we did not have funds, but others may say because of what some people wanted. It was a failure that happened itself. It was a failure that was failed, if you like, or if you understand what I want to say, or both. So yes, it's kind of hard when you have this kind of blockage that Felicity was talking about.
Thanks so much. It's really interesting. And I could also add what I think about the materials because from experience in other places that materials cost money, right? They cost money to develop. And even if they're developed, then there's money involved in publishing them. And then there's also money involved in the distribution because trucks have to be hired and they have to get out to the schools somehow. So I think the problem with funding is deep when it comes to materials. And now the ministry has linked implementation of bilingual education to the presence of materials. So that's almost sounds purposeful in its undermining of the policy. Is that
Yeah,
your
yeah. I think,
interpretation?
and the other thing, Carol, is that the curriculum keep changing. If the
Yeah,
curriculums change, you have to change the books. You have
yeah.
to change the way you train the teachers. So there are commands coming not only internally, but from outside as well. which lead to changes in terms of curriculum. The syllabus keep changing. One year we'll have millennial goals, and then we have other goals. You change what the system is saying. The change in terms of political system in the country also demand change. So the books that have been produced are not being used for a long time. That is another thing. They're expensive, yes, but if they could be used for 10 years or the changes,
Yes,
small changes, but it's not what is happening,
I
So
see.
that also is something to take into consideration. Yeah.
Yeah, good point. I wonder if I can ask. I had one other. I think it's a big question, and it's about. So years ago, when some of us were involved in the experiment in bilingual education in Mozambique. Teresa Veloso, who was an educational leader at the INDE, Feliciano mentioned the National Institute for the Development of Education. That was the researchers and the people who were supporting the bilingual education experiment. And she always felt very strongly that no one would agree if the entire country adopted bilingual education. But if it were adopted as an option, and you've already talked about how there's the monolingual in Portuguese option, and then there's the bilingual option. Um, so she always felt very strongly that it should be the choice of the school districts or the parents, or I don't know if she had a plan for exactly how that would happen, but that was also the basis for her work with the NGO Progreso. So I'm just wondering what you guys think about how it was proposed as an option, and do you think that that made it weaker, or it was that a good approach? And now thinking about what's happening now, what do you think about bilingual education as an option?
Yeah. In my case, I've been reflecting on that as well. I think the parents have the right to choose the program in which they want their kids to study. And in this country, as we have mentioned, Portuguese is considered to be the language of socioeconomic mobility. And in this country, whether we want or not, there are families that are already educating their kids exclusively in Portuguese. That's why we have today about 17% of the population having Portuguese as their mother tongue. To me, in a context like that, is not appropriate to have mother tongue based bilingual education for all, as it is in other countries. Because I think that we'll have some problems with mid-class and upper-class parents. And now we have situations in which they don't send their kids to public schools. So if we had that in public schools, they would send their kids to private schools in Portuguese or in Portuguese and English. So bilingual schools, again, will be second-class schools in this country. And will be also, when we say that mother tongue bilingual education is the best, it's because we're teaching the kids using the language they are strong in. So when we say that bilingual education, mother tongue based bilingual education will be for all, we are ignoring these 17% of the kids that also speak Portuguese. So I think it's a good choice, at least for the time being. We don't have a lingua franca, an African language, a lingua franca spoken throughout the country. The language that we have are spoken regionally. So I think the model now in place, having bilingual program and monolingual program and giving the parents to the option to have their kids in one or another, for me, is the best way to go. But we should treat both the same way. We should invest the same way in both of them. Yeah.
Yeah, there's where I think you guys have clearly shown that that's not happening.
That's good. Yes.
Carlos,
I
anything
think-
to add?
Yeah, I'll say just the same thing as Hussein says. And that's why I think language mapping is important, one side on the other. That's why community mobilization is important, because sometimes you have a child and a parent who have never spoken a word of Portuguese, but they still want their child to go to monolingual Portuguese. In those cases, I think mobilization is important, telling them the goals of bilingual education, what they're going to get there. But I also wanted to note something that seems to be coming up in our current context, where some say, I don't want to say elite, because the word elite, it's not well accepted in Mozambique in some circles, but where some middle class families are teaching their African languages to their children at home. And some of these families have been calling for mother tongue in schools, not as a language of instruction, but as subject.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I think that's some way of building on a bilingual society, a bilingual community. And the argument is still our identity, our culture, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I wanted to add at this point.
Yeah, I think it's the model that is being followed in South Africa and in Swaziland. Even though education is in English, they have those local language as subjects. So that is a model that, yes, can be implemented with some openness from many middle-class parents. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much to you both. We really appreciate your talk, and also your really deep, thoughtful answers to these questions. I feel like we could go on for longer, but we're right at the end of our time. So thanks again to you. Some people had to leave, but we've got it all on the recording. And I just want to also mention that our next webinar will be on May 20th, sorry, also a Wednesday, and we'll be hearing from Dear Jingran from India and one of his colleagues about implementation there. I hope that we'll all continue talking to each other about experiences in different countries and what everyone's doing to kind of address the issues. So thanks again, Carlos and Feliciano. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for inviting us,
Thank you.
Carol.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Have a good day. Night.
Bye. Yes.
Thank you.